Welcome to the Dreamit Dose. Traction is one of the most critical elements to get right when pitching investors. The problem is, most startups do a poor job describing it. Investors see thousands of deals each year, so they want to make sure that everything is working and headed in the right direction. This is your chance to give them a reason to believe that you're on the path to a very happy ending. There's just a few things that you need to get right and some common mistakes to avoid. Let's dive in. Traction. Investors want to hear about it, and startups definitely want to talk about it. But let's make sure you're talking about the right traction at the right times during your pitch. As we get into this, remember to talk about traction over time, not just an instance in time. Investors like to see trend lines, not points. Let's get into the traction you can cover. Let's say your pre-product points of traction you can talk about are the number of customers you've met with, the number of design partners you're working with. Maybe it's the number of customers that said they would trial or buy your product, or customers you've spoken to that have confirmed your pricing is spot on and they have a willingness to pay. One other thing if you're pre-product is you can talk about the traction around the number of signups for early access to your product or beta. Maybe you want to talk about results from online ad smoke tests. So your product, your website, your B2C offering isn't built out yet, but you're proving interest and intent to purchase through a smoke test. A final point you could talk about is intellectual property. Have you filed patents? So you could have traction and show growth around the IP within your firm. Let's say you have product, but you're not yet at revenue. Here are the traction points I suggest you address. You could talk about traction around your pipeline, showing the number of pilots and trials, preferably paid, that are in process and/or the results of those pilots and trials. Let's say you're a B2C company. You could highlight the number of user signups, downloads, or the engagement. Now, if you're paying for those downloads, you'll need to be ready to address what you're spending to get that traction. Finally, if you're working on a product where you need regulatory approval, like in the healthcare industry, you can discuss where you are on your trials and in your approval pathway if you need to go after something like an FDA 510(k). Now let's say you've crossed that magical threshold and you're at revenue. What's important to highlight for investors? You could talk about your MRR and ARR and make sure to discuss your projected CAC to long-term value LTV ratio. You could talk about traction around the number of customers you have or your user retention. As well, you could talk about traction and data around the engagement of your customers in your B2C product. If you're using a freemium model, you can talk about the traction around your conversion rates. And if in B2B you're using a land and expand strategy, you want to show evidence that that's working or will work. Now that we've covered what traction points you should be covering, when should you talk about it? I like to see a traction slide about 3/4 of the way through the deck. So you've laid out this story and you've started to describe the problem, the solution, the competition, total addressable market, go-to-market strategy, and then you bring up the traction that shows how it's all coming together. While your traction over time around revenue is most important, you can also walk investors through your sales pipeline from leads to closed sales. Cover important items like the number of customers in each phase, the percent transitioning between phases, time between phases, and value of each deal. Whatever you do, make it clear how your sales strategy is progressing. Pro tip, you don't need to wait to do a big reveal of your traction. Instead, you can drip bits of traction throughout your pitch to give evidence that things are working. Now, how and where do you drip? Maybe when you're talking about your problem statement, you could drip in a bit of traction around the number of customers that you've met with who specifically validated, yes, they have that problem. Maybe when you're talking about your solution, you can say the number of customers that have already moved forward. You're not telling them a revenue around that, the full-on traction, but you're just giving them an indication of how many people agree that this is a solution. Maybe you're going through your competition slide and you could talk about the top 2 or 3 key differentiators and benefits on your competition slide, how frequently you're winning based on that. One last example might be on your go-to-market strategy. Are you making progress on your initial customer segment? Instead of waiting for the big reveal 10 minutes later in your deck, you could just address lightly the number of customers that you've already secured in that initial customer segment. Word of warning, don't overdo the drip. Use it sparingly. You want to leave some drama and mystery for your full traction slide as you tell your story to investors. Next, I want to hit some power tips and huge mistakes we see startups make. Realize for investors, there's a ranking of traction they care about. What's the number one type of traction most investors care about? Revenue and profitability. What do they care about the least? The number of pitch competitions and best places to work award winnings that you've had. Look, if you have great revenue growth and you're lighting it on fire and you want to talk about a best places to work, that's terrific. It's icing on the cake. But if all you have is the icing on the cake, realize investors really don't care that much about it. Some other common startup mistakes that we see that you definitely want to avoid, first would be artificial traction manipulation. That's where you're already doing a spend with things like Google AdWords or Facebook ads, and then suddenly you goose it. You jam more cash into your paid spend unnaturally just to make your traction look better. If you're doing that, be ready to talk about it with investors because they're going to dive in and ask questions if suddenly there was some artificial manipulation that occurred to make your traction look better than it actually is. Next up, the faux traction logo wall. Look, don't put up a slide of logos trying to pass them off as paying customers when they're not. Instead, be transparent and be clear. Don't commingle a handful of paying customers with a slide full of logos that are only people that you're talking to. Instead, show your sales pipeline. Show the different companies that are on the customer journey with you from lead to closed sales. Another common mistake, mixing in traction from other products and services. Do the world a favor. If your pitch has been focused on one particular product, don't mix in traction from legacy products or consulting services you've been offering. When you're talking about traction, be focused on the traction for that product. Don't try to glom in other traction and make things look bigger than they actually are. Last common mistake, revenue traction that's mischaracterized. Look, if you have a mixture of recurring and non-recurring revenue, make sure to segment that out. Don't just talk about revenue and try to hide it and make it look like it's all recurring. So if you're selling a product that has implementation fees that occur one time or a one-time hardware cost, segment that out and talk about your recurring versus your non-recurring revenue. Again, be clear and transparent with investors. That's it. That's how you talk about traction when pitching. Which traction is important to your business? Investors like to see trend lines, not points. So remember to talk about traction over time. Remember to pick the right traction points based on if you're pre or post product, pre or post revenue, B2C or B2B, or have regulatory issues. Drip key traction points throughout your pitch and talk about not only your revenue, but traction throughout your sales pipeline. Finally, avoid all the non-transparent BS people use to try to mischaracterize their traction. That's your Dreamit dose in way over 5 minutes. Please leave your questions in the comments. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. We have a lot more coming. To see all of our doses, go to dreamit.com/dose. See you next time. Let's cover the trend, the customers wow, I can't even read. Instead, you can avoid all the non-transparent BS people use to mischaracterize their transaction. Again, I'm trying to give you bloopers.